What that is, just wait, you're in for a treat. Kevin's he's someone who thinks outside of the box. He's not limited by just the typical confines of what we think of when it comes to landscape, and that's one reason we asked him to speak here today. He has a background in horticulture with a graduate degree from the Longwood Public Horticulture Program. He worked as an intern at the Brooklyn Botanic Gardens, doing horticulture there, and he was also a horticulturalist on the High Line in New York City. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Williams, who's going to speak on No Vestige of a Beginning, No Prospect of an End, designing and living with others in the garden. So take it away, Kevin.
Thank you so much, Johnny. We decided to let Roy stay hooked up, so I'm going to rock star the microphone. Let me know if I'm not speaking loudly enough or directly into it. Thank you all for coming today. I'd like to just say a quick thank you to Roy for an amazing morning session and for sharing this platform with me. And also a thank you to Tree of Life Landscaping for being interested in my projects and inviting me to speak today. How many of you were at last year's Create Beauty Conference? That's great. I hope you walked away kind of feeling the same way that I did, which was just this huge need to read more, design, see, create, think, just more and more and more. It changed the whole trajectory of my year. So I'm honored to be able to share some of my thoughts with you today. Sorry for the color of that upper title. So, as Johnny told you, I was formerly a horticulturist, or a gardener as the title is, for the High Line in New York. And I think it's really interesting to think about that inspiration connection. As you all know, the High Line is a Pete Rudolph project, inspired in many ways by the work and expertise of Roy. So I like to think that I'm something of a tertiary product of that school or somewhere down the line. So thank you again, Roy, for all the influence and inspiration you may not have known that you've had on my life. I hope I'm able to expand on some of these experiences and offer some different ideas today. So I'm going to focus on a few of the projects I've worked on in the past year, along with all the influences, the thoughts, the philosophies that really drive them. And most of my gardens are still new and somewhat unproven. I don't have a ton of results to offer you today. Still, there's a process and a method behind them that I think is really worth sharing and examining a little bit. So I'd like you to know up front that I don't have any answers or rubrics. I just have ideas, questions, concerns, and some goals. I got that rather heavy title for the lecture from the 18th century Scottish geologist and thinker, James Hutton. No vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end refers to the theory of uniformitarianism. It's the idea that we can study the present geology in order to understand the past geologic forces that shaped the world and continue to shape the world today. This thought of Hutton's was extracted and used to create the concept of Gaia, the holistic living earth. Hutton's quote is also famously used by the punk band Bad Religion in their song No Control. Do we have anyone who's familiar? Excellent. No Control connected the ideas of geologic uniformitarianism, nihilism, and eventually an idea of acceptance of that. It posits that we must be able to submit to the idea that we are just a part of the process in order to find peace. We have to learn how to accept and live comfortably in that process, and we cannot control the outcome. So uniformitarianism creates, in Hutton's words, a succession of worlds that we live in and we experience. I think this is a good starting point for how we should view gardens and gardening, as successional worlds that operate under processes and autonomies that exist and need to be recognized as existing beyond our will as gardeners. The step garden at DBG, one of the gardens that I work in, is in itself both a collection of worlds and eventually can help point the way to a successional world. The step garden is built on the idea of finding kin. In the step garden, we compare, and in some place we mix the floras of the world's sister steppe regions, so the steppes of North America, South America, Central Asia, and Southern Africa. If you aren't familiar with the concept, steppes are semi-arid, Continental climates, they receive approximately 9 to 16 inches of precipitation a year. They exist in the rain shadows of major mountain ranges. They experience extremes in temperature, and they have soils that are rich in minerals with really low organic matter content. They span floristic biomes from forests to deserts, mountains to plains, but are most characterized by the grasslands and shrublands. As you probably already knew, we live on the eastern end of North America's steppe. So welcome to the steppe. The thesis of the steppe garden is that flora from each steppe region lives along similar ecological lines. They developed in similar environments under similar conditions, and they fill similar niches. For the most part, these plants should be able to exist together and compete with each other and create habitats in healthy ways. I am not a big photo collage person, but I think that this really says it all. You can see the very similar morphology of the shrubs and the grasses presented in these three very disparate regions. So in the steppe garden, we extrapolated these ideas and we created these crumbling mountains in miniature. We gave the plants really depauperate, mineral-rich soils, and we incorporated concepts of bare root planting into deep sand and gravel, and these are what the results have been. So the main soil mix for most of the steppe garden was a mixture of gravel, sand, and just a little bit of screen compost. In some areas, it was just sand and expanded shale. And then that would interface with the native soils underneath, usually at about 6 inches to a foot. They were laid on by contractors, so we didn't have a ton of control of how much went in. One of the reasons we did that was to give all the plants sort of excellent drainage and a way to chase their roots straight down through this really loose, fast-draining media and then hit the clay underneath and be able to expand pretty rapidly. And they really did. I should also say we bare root planted. Is that a practice that many of you or anyone does? A little bit? If you're unfamiliar, literally we shake and wash off all of the potting soil that it could have retained from the propagation facility so that it binds really quickly with the soil that you're planting it into. So these are some of the results. We put that in 2016. This shot was, I think, in spring of 2018. This is the Central Asian bed looking northward. And here's a detail of the Southern African summer rainfall bed of the steppe garden in August of 2018. There's some really interesting species used here that are commercially available, but I think are underused or kind of unknown. Does anyone use Themata triandra in their work? That's the sort of taller, more upright species in the back. Pogonarthria sclerosa, the herringbone grass, is sort of that lighter, more ephemeral grass in the front. In the corner, Helichrysum trilineatum, that's a really cool silvery selection that I think we're hoping to be able to release through Plant Select soon. And then you can see sort of the wispier flowers of Phygelius capensis, these really beautiful pinkish coral flowers, a really tough shrub. Here's a spring detail of one of our raised planters looking beyond at the Central Asian bed, showing the emergent or the bump layer of flora. The purple flower in the foreground belongs to Verbascum weedmoniatum, a much smaller and more well-behaved relative of Verbascum thapsus. And the Patagonian steppe section in the fall of 2018, this is still in a semi-nascent stage. But there are huge possibilities for horticulture in our region in the steppe garden. I think most of our major plant introductions for this region will come out in the next few decades from the plants researched and the communities established here. Our future world could really heavily depend on all of these successional ecologies.
Don't mind us.
Never do. And so we're not the only ones that are got the idea to use plants from these communities interchangeably. In 2017, just as the steppe garden was about to enter its second season, a book came out that I was really, really excited about. How many of you have Sowing Beauty in your arsenal? Just a couple. Okay, we're gonna run through this, so I highly recommend it. If you're unfamiliar, James Hitchmo, the author of the book, is a professor at the University of Sheffield's Landscape Architecture Department, and he's responsible for what I consider the UK's most innovative gardens. With his colleagues, Sarah Price and Nigel Dunnett, they were the driving creative force behind London's Olympic Park. And here's some of his work at RHS Wisley. Hitchmo uses almost exclusively herbaceous vegetation that exists in similar habitats, and he transposes these into novel plant communities in urban places to see how they'll act. He likes to ask if these communities can become self-sustaining, in a sense, immortal designs. And he also investigates how these landscapes are perceived by the public. The designs are really dynamic in the sense that not only do they change through the seasons, through all the things that we've been taught to do of staggered flower times, varied textures, sizes, shapes, and colors, but he also focuses on different planting layers, not stacked layers, but fully integrated into the designs. And he also likes to allow the plants themselves to wander, compete, and regroup. There's no final or ultimate landscape here. The process itself of becoming is put on full display. The other bit that I think is so impressive is that the gardens are designed and implemented almost entirely from seed. So he lays out the process in Sowing Beauty, but it's also explained really eloquently in this video about his work in Oxford Botanic Gardens.
In 2008, the University of Oxford Botanic Garden embarked upon a major redevelopment of the lower triangle of the garden. This area was first planted in the 1940s, and all the trees and shrubs had become over-mature together. So the entire site was cleared, the site was levelled, and then the area that was going to be the new border was covered in 3 inches of sand that was raked and rolled to be totally level. Professor James Hitchmore of Sheffield University had devised a plan with plants from 3 different geographical regions, from the Mediterranean, South Africa and North America. Tom Price, the garden's curator, mixed the seeds to a very precise recipe. James then came down to Oxford, the seed was mixed with sawdust and then spread over the entire site, ensuring that the seeds were randomly spread through the mixture. Once the seed had been sown, it could be raked carefully into the sand before the whole area was covered in jute netting, a very loose weave so that the plants could grow up through the holes in the matting. This matting is there to hold the sand and the seeds in place. In the spring of 2011, it was very bare. In the summer of 2012, it looked a bit weedy, but by 2013, we had created a new wow feature at the Botanic Garden. And here is James talking to a group of visitors about the border.
With these sort of borders, potentially, there is no edge. And so you've got, instead of like borders like tearing up, so it's very dark and shaded towards the back, here you have a much more open system, and that does mean things like the Indian paintbrush can potentially operate in the middle almost as well as on the edge. And it's the same with a lot of the other species. So I mean, what we've tried to do here, and what we'll try to do in the longer term through management, is to maintain that sense of openness, so we get lots of light coming into the middle of the plantings because there's no need to tear up. And that will then allow us to keep a lot of the small species which need a lot of light, and you can have these effects cutting right across the planting. Because I think that's why this is visually striking, because patterns sort of repeat and they're not just confined to an edge.
So I think that's really, really stunning work. If you're interested, you can search on YouTube for James Hitchmo Step Summit, and you can watch a lecture that he gave in 2017 at Denver Botanic Gardens. In his lecture, he says something that's very interesting and I think very honest. He says not to take everything in his presentation or about his methodology literally, but rather use it as inspiration. One of the things he points out, I think maybe specifically because the talk is in Colorado, is that he's taking plants from steppe regions and moving that flora and palette to another biome. Chiefly, he works in that of the wet and mild maritime United Kingdom. So one of his strategies is to dry out this habitat in order to grow our plants, which I think is really interesting because usually we have to moisten our habitat to grow animals' plants. It makes sense though, a part of his logic in doing this, using these species in the UK, is the anticipation of climate change. Chiefly the question of where an ecologically flexible island will turn for its next infusion of flora. For a potentially hotter, drier climate, steppe flora is an obvious choice, especially because Europeans have different definitions of steppe and often includes parts of Australia and the Iberian Peninsula, so things that are also not as cold hardy, but could take things a little bit milder. The question is, where would we look? What plants will become the dominant healers for us through climate change? What will our gardens look like in 2060 or 2080? And how will we decide to implement those gardens? I think it's also interesting to pay attention to the use of sand, his sand strategies. It's similar to how we built the step garden, or similar to the theory of gravel gardening, which Roy will cover a bit more later, but sand creates a thick layer of inorganic media, both as a smother mulch and as a way to provide adequate drainage. But as a lot of the system in gravel gardening controls the movements of plants, at least for a short amount of time, sand or crushed concrete or rock dust creates a system of planting that we can influence, but others can influence as well, as in others being the plants in the gardens can influence this. And Hitchmo takes this to some extremes, which is why it's worth to watch some of his lectures or to read his books, but he has some projects where he's literally crushed a building to the ground and sown seed into it, and it becomes a gorgeous meadow. Part of this is kind of understanding that our plants, step plants, don't like a lot of organic matter. They don't like the buildup of organic matter. That's what makes things sort of weedy or get out of control, but they're used to existing and growing in really, really sparse environments. So Hitchmo likes to focus on the sparsity, the bad soil, accepting what you have and making it even worse, and then seeing what survives in it. And so the fine particulates, they're much more conducive to germinating seed, and this is a little bit utilitarian in one way. Seeds are really inexpensive in bulk. So for a couple $100, you can sow a couple thousand square feet. You'll probably also spend more on the sand than the seeds, but that's all part of that good infrastructure that can make it go a long way. And the other reason of using sand is more philosophical. The designs are not about controlling where plants are and how they interact. They allow for some sort of agency, for an ability to surprise us through emergence and their germination. This is, to me, complexity and really an abdication of control in the garden. I'm going to go down the rabbit hole a little bit here. I see Hitchmo's style of creating garden spaces as being the preeminent link between horticulture and the philosophical posthumanities, and possibly a real answer to our question of why do we garden? Has anyone read Morton, Strathern, Graham, Haraway, or anything in that vein of philosophy? This strain of philosophy, it deals with the idea that awareness and morality should be extended beyond just humans. It recognizes that others, as in non-human others, do exist and have rights and influence in this world. So many contend that our non-recognition of this is why we treat the world like we do, as a resource and not as a place full of partners that we can work with. Roy, may I quote you for a moment? In No Maintenance, you'll read a quote from Roy that says, "Our own needs and self-importance have prompted us to drown out and speak for other living beings." And I think this kind of cuts right to the heart of it. I'd also like to tie this style of design to the term symbiosis. M. Beth Dempster coined the term, and Donna Haraway paraphrased the definition as collectively producing systems that don't have self-defined spatial or temporal boundaries. Information and control are distributed among the components. The systems are evolutionary and have the potential for surprising change. To me, this is uniformitarianism in the garden. There's no vestige of a beginning, no prospect of an end, just partners and a process. So these ideas of symbiotic systems are all central to Haraway's writings. I highly recommend the book Staying with the Trouble. It's a beautiful example of this philosophy applied. It floats the idea that in order for us to escape the Anthropocene, or the age in which humanity has the largest influence on the planet, we have to be able to make kin with other creatures. That is, treat other creatures as if they were family, as if our lives and our deaths depend on them, which ultimately they really do. And I've been preoccupied with how this could fit into horticulture, and I believe this philosophy has always been present to some extent, the fascination with and the honoring of other creatures, specifically plant life and plant communities. I mean, we spend our entire careers or our lives or our free time enshrining an entire other kingdom of life and fawning over it. So I believe we as gardeners are gardeners at some level because we've always understood this. And I think we need to start using this philosophy as a touchstone for our work and implement these ideas of equality and sharing responsibility for our creations with other creatures, specifically the creatures that we're creating with. So does this make sense that work like Hitchmo's treats gardens as self-defining, spontaneous systems, and while recognizing that we're also part of the system, tries not to practice control over the other creatures, but rather lets their intentions and desires and our intentions and desires be expressed in some sort of balance. So I've been really interested in implementing these ideas more into my work, and I wanted to see if it was possible to create a symbiotic garden in a meaningful and effective way. And I also wanted to test out Hitchmo's methodology in non-maritime climates. So maybe it doesn't work to dry down a garden bed using 3 to 5 inches of sand in a place that only gets 15 inches of rain a year. So the processes and the ideas weren't exactly the same, but to some extent this was already done at Denver Botanic Gardens. The Laura Porter Smith Plains Garden was created in 1983 in an attempt to recreate as much as possible the pre-settlement prairies of Colorado. So there's a sandhills, short, mid, tall grass, and a riparian section that are all represented in this part of the garden. Has anyone gotten to visit this before? Excellent. It's stewarded in a very kin-like way. Plants are allowed to seed, run, compete, and coexist, and this is what it looks like over the course of 36 years. I think it's found a fantastic balance. Initially, to establish the garden, seed was collected within a 30-mile radius of DBG in order to get a lot of local ecotypes, and was then both direct sown into the ground and grown out in the greenhouses and then planted. The ecologists and the horticulturists that originally implemented the garden took a really literal approach and based the plantings on prairie plant density studies, which meant that sometimes in the entire garden they could only plant 1 or 2 specimens of a certain species. So this led to a lot of those populations collapsing or not establishing really quickly. Still, over the 36 years, there's about 249 species in this garden. Also, the irrigation has been shut off in the garden since 1998, and it's burned regularly about every 3 years. The thought behind it burning is because this is a fire cycle region, this is a fire cycle steppe region, and this clears out the duff. So they live in their own debris for quite a bit of time, and then you start to see a decline in the species that are present and the way that they're presenting themselves. And directly after burning, there's a huge reflush of growth. Seeds lose their dormancy, and the species really start to reestablish a more vigorous presence. This is a picture from the spring. This is just seconds after that fire ripped through. I'd never seen a prairie fire before, and I know that this is, in some ways, not a true one, but it was terrifying. It's like there's no way you could outrun that. It did reflush very thickly about 3 weeks later. I find the Plains Garden to be just absolutely enchanting. It's a shining example of the idea of a symbiotic system expressed through the shortgrass prairie aesthetic. As Johnny mentioned before, one of my gardens is a 2-block-long streetscape, the Josephine streetscape. It was installed in 2010 around a parking garage structure, and it was made up of half cultivated beds and half Kentucky bluegrass tree lawn. The initial design was developed and installed to be these large swaths of plants. It was very linear, blocky, literal kind of stuff. I started working with it in 2016, and I had the goal of shifting it towards a more xeric, naturalistic style. This is my only garden without a curatorial or a collections-based theme, so I have freedom to play with and test the designs and some plants that I don't in the other gardens. So this was a really good place to start playing with some of these different ideas. This is an area of the streetscape that we call the Wedge. I took this picture in 2016, just when I started working there. This was planted in a really blocky pattern. You can see there's a row of Harava Ichu in the back, Pennisetum, Oriental Carly Rose, and little blue stems sort of hiding back in the corner there. There were a few interesting species that were added throughout the years, most notably Diaschia intergerima, Coral Canyon. But there really wasn't enough in here to tip the scales of the design. I kind of looked at this as a garden in decline. I don't see it as being pregnant with opportunities for change here. And yes, that is wood chip mulch that you can see. Here it is in 2018 after I was able to work with it for a few years, trying to break up the linearity of the design, balance the heavier and lighter elements. Additionally, I've added dozens of shrubs and hundreds of different herbaceous forbs and perennials that really haven't emerged into the visual fray yet, so I expect it to continue to change pretty heavily over the next few seasons, but I'm really happy with the difference so far. Here's another section that's called the South Wall. In 2018, I've been working with a lot of the plant material that the contracted designers originally chose, just dividing and speckling and rearranging the species and adding new things sort of as my budget allows and as lend themselves to the design. The streetscape also includes 5 raised planters that I call micro meadows. Until 2016, these were mostly used for annual displays. I've been packing them with as many perennials as I could find, often very adventitiously, anything that shows up in the free pile in our back-of-house nursery. But things are really starting to build. Most of the plantings in this picture are too small to really peek over the edge. Here's a quarter shot from 2018. You can see that things are getting really dense and complex and starting to fill in. And another picture from 2018. I think this shows very well the possibilities of a densely planted, diverse garden, given a couple seasons of development. So here are some of the turf areas that used to exist. Josephine had about 10,000 square feet of it. This was very standard Kentucky bluegrass lawn. It wasn't at all compatible with my vision for a xeric, hyper-naturalistic garden, and in my opinion, it's not at all compatible with the values that we as an institution really try to impart to the public. This would be the target area for my step-driven Hitchmoian landscape. This before shot, if you'll indulge me for a bit, really evokes something else in my mind. Yeah. Can you see that? I missed a really good photo opportunity to not just stand angrily on the lawn, but I didn't put this together until just a few months ago. So if you're unfamiliar, this is the cover for the 1988 release by Bad Religion called Suffer. Again, anyone suffer? Thanks. Here's a teenager that's either burst into flames through righteous anger or have set themselves on fire out of protest to this really banal, heavily prescribed, controlled landscape. You know, I hope that we're all still raging against this today, but you know, this was 30 years ago. Luckily, I had a plan to move forward. I didn't have to set myself on fire. My initial proposal for the site included 66 species of grasses, perennials, and shrubs to be both seeded and planted. This was broken up into 9 specific microclimates throughout the 2-block-long space. And I sowed at a planting density of 166 plants per square meter. This factored in a 19% germination rate, so still pretty thick, even though I knew that a lot of it wasn't going to come up. By the end of the planting season last year, I'd swelled the species count from 66 to 129 for the space, and I'll probably add a few dozen more this year because I can't help myself. And this being a really thin and long space, mostly experienced by passing traffic, I wanted to create the feeling of continuity and thought of this garden experience more like a motion picture. So repetition and gradual change would impact the high-speed observer, as someone driving a car, much more than a series of disjunct plantings would down the space. So for each microclimate, I retained similar species, and then I repeated the palettes throughout the streetscape as the conditions really dictated. These palette pages were how I sold my design to my supervisors, because I couldn't draw out a traditional landscape design of something that I was going to put seed in a bag, shake it up, and throw it out. I didn't know where things would be. Things were going to decide on their own where they would be. So I'd like to point out just a few of the species that I'm pretty excited to introduce into this landscape. Aristida diffusa, all the way up in the corner. It's a really soft mounding grass from South Africa. It doesn't mind being pushed around a lot, so it can go into really dense situations. It has this beautiful translucent purplish feel for most of the growing season, and it's extremely drought tolerant. Artemisia ludoviciana, over in the corner there, a native partly woody forb that's just extremely morphologically variable, and it thrives in a ton of different conditions. I've seen it growing in part to deep shade or in full blazing sun. Does anyone grow ludoviciana right now? Excellent, it's so nice. Also, Atriplex canescens and Atriplex convertifolia, really fun flowering and seed-producing high desert shrubs. they have this kind of wild form when they get a little bit more mature, and it'd be great to see more of those on our streets. I also included a variety of drought-tolerant carices for both underplanting and interstitial planting. I believe it was on the Federal Twist blog. Does anyone read Federal Twist? No, Carex was referred to, sort of tongue-in-cheek, as the unromantic stitchers for the dense garden. I'm really counting on them to be some workhorses for this design to fill out the shadier spots all around the street trees and connect into the sunnier spots. I would point out Carex, Brevoire, Bicknellii, and Rosea are more of a drier prairie species that my research has shown, at least, and I've seen pretty decent germination on them even the first year. I'm also excited about the shade-tolerant Eurybias and Erigerons. I'm hoping they'll develop a really heavy presence through seeding in. And also excited to test the tolerances of Elaeagnus commutata, which is North America's only native Elaeagnus, which I collected from seed in Montana a few years ago, legally. Rudbeckia occidentalis is a fantastic structural species too, and Salvia reptans autumn sapphire, a plant select release that just impresses me more and more each year. If you're unfamiliar, it's a perennial forb that has a shrub-like stature, but can be cut to the ground every year. And Quercus hubbardii too, just a really fantastic shrubby oak that I don't see being used a lot, but it covers almost 5 million acres of the southern steppe. So it exists, and it's very successful at existing.
What's its size, Kevin?
Eventually, when it becomes mature, it's about this tall and then covers 5 million acres.
Oh, that's amazing.
So but it takes a long time to do that. And it can be trained and worked with and made to fit the space that you like. Also very slow growing, so it probably wouldn't do that in our lifetimes. So I won't go through all of the species, but I just wanted to seek out species that I hadn't seen used often or at all in a lot of the Eastern garden designs. And maybe they weren't used because they're intolerant of non-steppe conditions or just because they've been overlooked or not tested. But I wanted to mix them with some of the more workhorse species like the Panicum virgatum, so people could see the potential of expanding and adding to the designs that they already have. If you have that Panicum virgatum traffic island at planted on 3 feet apart, then what happens if you fill that with Coleria macrantha and Eurybia divaricata and Monarda punctata? How does that all work together then? So on May 15th, 2018, we broke ground. We started by edging the space. We took away about a foot of turf on all sides. There was an irrigation system in there to maintain all that lawn, and I wanted to keep it active through the germination of the seeds, so we didn't want to just tear that out. Simultaneously, we used sod cutters to cut to a depth of about 3 to 3.5 inches, although we had to vary in some places because of the tree root density. I'd like to give a shout out to a couple of my volunteers who are in the audience who may have worked on that project with me. It was horrible. Then we cleared the sod, and we very triumphantly put it into a huge pile to dry out for a few weeks. Just as a quick side note and a side project, knowing that irrigated turfgrass is one of the primary habitats for Japanese beetle larvae in the Front Range, one of my colleagues, Sonia Anderson, set up and counted several transects as we were removing the turf. She estimated that in the 10,000 square feet we removed, we probably eliminated about 40,000 Japanese beetles from the environment. That pile of sod from the last picture was just swarming with birds for weeks afterwards, picking off the larvae. So keep that in mind when you're working with your clients and they say they want a lawn and how do we deal with the Japanese beetles, because it's not, they're not a compatible desire. Next, we filled the space with sand. This was 100 tons of sand. Because this wasn't a perfectly level surface, the street itself slopes from south to north. Soil was mounded a little more near the street trees and people edged at different depths. So most areas have between 3 and 5 inches of sand on them. One area that I'll highlight a little bit later only received about 1 or 2 inches of sand. Next, the seed was applied and we rolled out and pinned the jute netting. All in all, the whole process took us about 6 days, and it was really a beast of a job. Then until mid-October, and honestly probably a little bit later, we bare root planted and watched for germination. So all in all, I put about 2,500 plants in the ground. I'm not like Hitchmill, I'm not just waiting for the germination to happen. And out of those ultimate 129 species, 53 were direct sown. Here's some really early germination, which I was just out of my mind excited to see. I thought I won't get fired. Here's a little bit more progress about a month later. And a little bit later than that. So maintenance-wise, to give you the rundown, this garden in its first year has been kind of a dream. I spent one morning every other week for about 4 hours just walking the space playing weed cop. I think the biggest exploiter of the space this first year were cottonwood seedlings, which makes perfect sense because we created a moist sand bed and we had a really heavy cotton year. The plan for the irrigation, so Hitchmo didn't go over that in that part of his video, but he recommends watering for 12 weeks or until you see most of the seed has germinated and then cutting it off completely, and that's in England. I watered for the entire summer, and then we shut it off as we shut off our irrigation. Because I've put a lot of more seeds in this fall and winter, I'm considering turning the irrigation back on, but already I've lowered it. It was watering every day for several minutes, maybe 10 minutes at a time to keep that tree lawn absolutely soaked. I had it on twice a day at 3-minute bursts each time. So already I was able to dry it down a lot. And some of the concerns were the street trees, would they suffer by not getting that additional water? And at least this first year, which we had a fairly dry summer, they didn't show any signs of stress or not. These roots are deep. And a really good example of if you're scared to do this, to dry down a lawn because the trees are there. Directly across the street, which I don't have a picture of, is a streetscape that's managed by Denver Water. They have had the irrigation broken and turned off for 10 years, and it has staphylobiums that are twice this size, and they've never shown drought stress. So I found this to be a really hard space to photograph effectively, to really capture from the beginning. So in order to tell this story with some consistency over time, I've been working with the garden's videographer, who came up with the idea of using a drone to create almost a transformative walk through the space. And since it's only been a season, the transformation isn't yet so dramatic. See my supervisor, Mike Bone, wrestling with the sod cutter. And a few volunteers planting there. But it's awesome for me to see this storytelling tool being applied, and I hope that it can really tell the story of this space. If it's successful, and if it's not, we'll delete the video.
Never happened.
Back to turf. So also a few challenges and early successes that we faced in getting the garden installed. It probably goes without saying, but removing all that turf and replacing it with all that sand was really hard labor. But it's attractive because the overall cost. The garden, as it stands now, cost about 60 cents a square foot. And I put that number up a little bit because we grow a lot of plants in-house that I included in the design. With all the plants I ordered, which was probably about 700 to 900 plants, the seed, the jute, the sand, it was closer to 50 to 55 cents a square foot. That's one of the reasons how I sold it, to transform this huge space, but it would cost them a lot of money. Yeah?
Is that just material or is that labor?
Great question. It doesn't factor in any labor. If this had been contracted out, it would be exponentially more. But the labor was in-house, and I didn't count my own time as part of that. Also, we used a lot of volunteer labor, which, again, for a huge project, really changes the price of it. But it's not at all bad for a home garden or a small space if you're doing it yourself. So almost from the beginning, the streetscape received a lot of foot traffic, which it presumably probably always had, but now is really evident because of the softness of the sand. This got exponentially worse during our holiday season. As you might know, we have a large holiday display. It draws a lot of visitors. This is a poor little banana yucca that's just trampled, and it breaks my heart. Also, just compounded by the trampling, we had a lot of issues with the tidiness of the jute and with it holding up in some areas. We had to cut a lot of it away because it just became absolutely trashed. This definitely bothers me to some extent. This was taken in December of 2018, and as predicted by Hitchmo's process, there just really wasn't a ton of germination that first year, which is expected, but also provided a little bit of a challenge to interpret that to the neighbors who were wondering why we took out a perfectly good lawn and replaced it with a playground. However, one section decided it really wanted to grow like this. This is the northernmost section of the streetscape. I can't really say what happened, but I do have some ideas. So something that we considered an early challenge, but actually allowed us to make a really interesting comparison, was that some of the areas were really congested with tree roots. And unlike Hitchmo's process, which kind of references areas that have been completely cleared, we couldn't take down the street trees because of, well, tons of reasons. We couldn't take down the street trees and then dig out all the root systems that had been developing for decades and decades. So in a lot of places, we couldn't remove to the 3-inch depth. I estimate that in this area, there's probably only about 1.5 inches of sand before it interfaces with the soil, maybe less in some places. And I think through capillary action, the surface of the sand was able to be kept a lot moister and allowed for better germination. A few great germinators on this that happened the first year: Helianthus occidentalis right in the front, Artemisia ludoviciana, which you can see is really making up a workhorse of this design, and then Euphorbia marginata, looking really well and germinating pretty well throughout the entire streetscape. We're also allowed to put caution tape around this garden, which meant that it wasn't getting the foot traffic that the rest of the space received. I think another stunner early on is Oligoneuron rigidum in the front, that transition to those gorgeous white seed heads in the fall. And here's the same area, that successful area after the first frost of the season. I really hope that one of our areas of success, or at least something that we can count on as an advantage for this garden, will be that it was a fluid design meant to allow species to come to terms with each other. This design isn't about being static or true to a plan, but finding plants that will thrive together and impose themselves both on each other and on the space that they're in. So this is all about staying flexible and having fun and kinship, not control. So I hope if you're ever at DBG, consider walking away from the gardens into the streetscape and checking this out sometime. Another project in the same vein that I'd like to share with you was an experiment to install a Hitchmo-style garden, but appropriate for a Mediterranean climate. So I actually did this a few months before Josephine in south central Los Angeles to take a stab at a chaparral garden. Chaparral, if you're not familiar, is a really diverse dryland shrub community. It once made up really large swaths of Southern California. And it's typified by salvias, ceanothus, artemisias, sumacs, and just dozens of other really amazing things. And of course, there's bulbs, interstitial grasses, and forbs as well. The technique that we used was similar to what we had already discussed, except we didn't lay down any jute fabric, just turf removal, sand, seeds, and plants. So there also isn't an irrigation system installed in this place. It's only 1,000 square feet, so it was pretty easy to water by hand. Here's a compilation picture of progress over the first 2 months from the bottom up. You can see the germination of the interstitial layer mostly, which was composed of Butalo gracilis, Festuca rubra, Schultzia californica, and Linum lewisii. This is the 6-month mark. So you can see some of the poppies are still blooming, but since they're entering their hot, dry season, a lot of the things are going dormant. Here it is at 7 months. I like this shot because you can kind of see the growth in the shrubs a little bit more. And then this is a year later, after I went out to help with its first cutback. I don't think this will really come into its own until the shrubs bulk up, which should take another 3 years or so, but it's starting to show more character, definitely different from just the pure sand pit, and different from the Bermuda grass lawn that most of the neighborhood has. There's an article by David Goodsell called Horticultural Semiotics, Ugly Beautiful Los Angeles. Did anyone come across that? Well, it's really cool. Look it up if you get the chance. He owns a design firm called Terremoto, which is out in Los Angeles. And he broke down in this article the meta trends of landscaping that you can see throughout Los Angeles. He broke them down chronologically. So they start with native being sort of pre-settlement Los Angeles, into oasis, the Spanish and colonial Mexican flora kind of feel, then post-war, which is the turf grass, foundational planting, rose garden, Los Angeles, and then feral, the mix of natives and exotics and all those other things that kind of swirl around Los Angeles at this point.
Could you say the name of that article?
It's by David Goodsall, and it's called Horticultural Semiotics, Ugly, Beautiful Los Angeles.
Kevin, is that without irrigation, you said?
This is without irrigation. This was hand watered for the first 3 months by the owner. And then I had to beg him to stop because he was like, no, they're not gonna grow. They're gonna die. But they did fine. And Los Angeles is getting like a record year for rain right now, so I'm not too worried about this season. So he breaks, David Goodsall in that article breaks down these meta trends, and I just think it's an awesome idea to look at and see for different cities or municipalities how we can really do that and frame what we're looking at in the landscape, how we think it should change, where we want it to go. The owners have been calling this the California wave garden as opposed to the Dutch wave. But I wonder if it harkens back to native times, if the wave turns on itself and becomes more like an ENSO and the cycle's closed. I'm starting to run up against my time, but before I say goodbye, do I have a few more minutes?
Yeah.
Tony? Yeah. I'd like to offer some thoughts on the future and where I think there are huge possibilities for horticulture and design in our region. Is anyone familiar with this map? It's titled The Potential Natural Vegetation of the Conterminous United States. It was made by August Kukler in 1966. There's no doubt we've lost species and habitats, but I just think this is awesome, and how much potential really is truly in this map. It's easily found on Google if you'd like to explore it. I know it's not very readable from here. Of course, Denver sits squarely in the brown Bootaloo-Buck-Lower region, but really exploring almost over from the pink to the light green, up to the yellow, and down into a lot of that orange. These are plants, so to speak. We share similar water availability, soil composition, cold and heat hardiness, and elevations with these regions. So we can look to these places as models when considering how to build symbiotic gardens that are appropriate for our landscapes. And of course, plants are extremely adaptable. They're living creatures, they want to live, and there are lots and lots of crossovers from coast to coast. That's why so many of our plants can go off and become European stars or celebrated New Yorkers, or how East Coasters can bring whatever they want over and grow it in the Front Range to some extent, maybe little bits, not everything they want. But also we probably have as much in common with the Californian and Mexican flora as we do with the eastern regions. I think that's something we have to explore and exploit a little bit more. Still, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of species from the east that can't be grown well in the west, and the same thing from the west that can't be grown well in the east. And the same is true with our sister steppes. You think of Argentinian flora versus Chilean flora, just separated by a mountain, or the Cape flora of South Africa, or the Karoo flora. And these excluded extremes, I think, is where we can really stand out in horticulture and design. And this is where we can make that sense of place that we talk about a lot, but I'm not sure that we really make. I'm not going to beat everyone to death with this, but these are precipitation and a very, very funny general soil map of the US. And when we look at the current leaders of our design movements, our heroes, the naturalistic new perennial, ecological matrix, whatever wave movements, we look to the Northeast or Northern Europe or England. And these are areas that have different soils than us. They receive radically different rainfall amounts than us. And again, tolerance is a spectrum, and there are rarely hard lines in living systems. But these are factors that could be more influential in our plant palettes, which will influence the communities that we build, and ultimately whether or not our designs struggle or they decide to become complex systems. I've been just extraordinarily taken by the diverse systems of our shrublands. I'm really surprised that we don't have more shrub community-driven design. These are just beautiful, climate change adapted, flexible, responsive plant communities that I think are still out on the far horizon of design. And this isn't to say that shrubs haven't been incorporated into naturalistic design, but their diversity, I think, has been somewhat overlooked, and I certainly did it with the Josephine Streetscape. And their shrubland composition and dynamics just hasn't really driven things too much. This is a Rus glabra and little bluestem prairie in southeastern North Dakota. There's some speculation that the ignoring shrubs is sort of a direct rebellion by new perennial movement designers against the boxwood, holly, and juniper atrocities that have been committed for the past 30 years. If you have a chance, another article that I read and really liked, written by Adrienne Ayers-Fisher on the website Ecological Gardening. It focuses on Midwest US landscape amnesia. And she discusses how in some ways native shrubs have kind of been wiped from our collective memories. And she calls for the use of more shrubs and plant communities to create truly complex ecosystems. Because a lot of these places were very shrubby to begin with, and those shrubs were also fire adapted. So you could even use them in a system where you have to mow them to the ground every year. Some examples in our neck of the woods, rabbit brush, Artemisia filifolia, winter fat, Amorphocanescens, even Cercocarpus montanus can be mowed to the ground pretty much every year. This is an office park that butts up against the High Plains Environmental Center in Loveland. I consider this like a diptych. We can call it two shrubscapes. One side is that bluegrass lawn and that absolutely pitch perfect shrubbery. The other side is actually a rabbit brush remnant prairie. This used to be railroad property, so no one could develop on it or touch it. So it remained there and stuck there. You know, it's funny that the people in the building get to look at the nice prairie, but the prairie has to look at the building. Which would you prefer to look at and be surrounded by? Right. And I'm sorry if the responsible designer is here today. We can talk afterwards. Here's another cool possibility. This is a shrubland that exists on the really dry edges of the sandhill shortgrass prairie of western North Dakota. In Planting in a Post-Wild World, Claudia West and Thomas Rainier define shrublands as one of our landscape emotional archetypes, meaning that we don't necessarily have to understand these places to intrinsically connect with them. Do you find this confusing or moving? One of my colleagues, Michael Geedy, and I are starting to work on a philosophy of Western shrubscape aesthetics and extraction. This is a Rocky Mountain community of Artemisia and Ericomeria. Can you see the potential in this? Here it is broken down, showing potential swaths, speckling, and interstitial plantings. It's a little, Keith Haring-ish, I think. This is a Guderitzia, Rus, and Yucca community that's just outside of Boulder, that exists on a hill that's right above a road cut. Actually, a really fascinating hill, but that's another thing. So I'm hoping that we can start to use tools like this to show designers how it can be really simple to create complex, emotionally arresting designs using our shrubby friends. This was on a wild seed collection trip last fall. I hope that this conference does for you what it did for me last year. Please stay open and perceptive, resist the urge to control in your work, invite the intentions of the non-human other, and continue to create beautiful worlds. Thank you for your time today.
Kim, would you mind taking a few questions? Anybody has some? All right, we'll just open it up to about 5 or 10 minutes for questions.
Any questions? Yes?
On the Josephine streetscape, what kinds of trees are there that you have to look around, and how will you balance their water needs with the planting that you do?
Could you
yeah,
just...
Sure. The question was what kind of trees are on the Josephine streetscape and how will we balance the water needs of the trees with what was sown and planted on the streetscape. The most mature trees on the site are Stiphinolobium japonicum, the Sephora tree. There's also some small maples. There's actually an Osage orange planted at one point. I'm not going to balance their water needs. I'm going to make them chase their roots deep. If the trees die, I'm not particularly hurt by that because I want to establish a different type of ecology in the area, something that's a mix between a grassland and shrubland, and then the more adult shade trees. If the city of Denver has an issue with that, then that's something that we'll have to discuss. But up to this point, it hasn't been a problem. Like I said, my good example for that is that across the street where the trees have been established and they have been watered for a decade, they have not shown signs of stress. They're just not growing as vigorously as a shade tree would, because it wouldn't in Denver anyway. So we have to change our expectations. Also, I think a strategy to deal with it is looking at some of the Quercus species that could be medium height and not gigantic shade trees, but could be more tolerant of our conditions. So maybe saying that if we're not irrigating, then we have to change our expectations of the species that we put in the ground. Any other questions?
I'm
Yes.
just curious about when you just put a layer of sand on top of a layer of clay. Is that?
It makes sandy clay, not concrete. Yeah. It's still completely pliable, even with our heat and dryness. It has not hardened. Although layers of calcite in the Colorado landscape and planting is really common. So if you go out to the prairie and dig deep, you're going to hit a hard layer on the interfaces between the sandier soils that have washed off of the mountain and this clay that has sifted down between it. So I'm not worried about that juncture happening.
And then how about like in parts of Aurora, there's sand and then there's sand and then there's more sand 11 feet down.
So it sounds like you just have to scrape off the turf.
Well, I'm saying, would that same plant palette do well without needing a layer that holds water a little more, but just continually drains and drains and drains?
That's a good question. And I don't know the full answer. I would expect there's tons of things that you could plant there without having to retain a level of, water retention.
Is that the definition of beachfront property?
Sure. Yes.
What about the wind with your sand and the jute netting?
Yeah, the question was, did the wind affect the sand or jute netting? And no, it didn't. There's a pretty constant breeze there from the traffic going by. And although it blew tons of leaves onto the streetscape, just that constant action, none of the sand or jute reacted to that.
Why can't people walk on the sidewalks?
I made it because we were taught to play in sandboxes when we were young. Anything else? Yes?
Could you talk a little bit about how you put together the original palettes of plant material?
Sure.
Where you pulled that from?
Sure. The question was how I put together the original palettes of plant material. I went with things that were commercially available. So I looked through, my sources were Prairie Moon, Western Native. I sourced some things from Applewood, some things from Gelito, and maybe something else will come back to me. A few other seed sources as well. So I wanted to look with things that I knew that I could obtain, not things that I would have to grow and harvest off of. That was really the first driver of it, but I still tried to be diverse. I don't know if I was successful or not in my choices. Then I looked through the palette. I thought about establishment, bloom times, growth rates, and sort of put those things together and tried to balance between grasses, sedges, forbs, and shrubs. And really those visual plant palettes helped me a lot. Being able to look at the pictures of all the species I'd be putting together, making sure that they meshed well together, and then deciding on proportions sort of based onto that. Yes?
Looking at these designs, it kind of brings to mind to me that so often we're putting these landscapes into leftover spaces in our built environment. Have you thought about how this kind of design could and should be affecting our planning departments, our suburban design, and our architecture entirely?
Yeah, and I think that a lot of HMO's work is focused on that. I have not had a lot of influence into those regions, but I do know that there are people who work for the city who are taking notice of these new designers and are trying to work to implement these new styles, these new methods of planting, implementing, and stewarding these spaces. So it's happening, I think. We need to be optimistic like Roy that this is happening. If that's it, then thank you very much.
Thank you.